So without further ado, I want to introduce to you Mr. Frank Sprague.
Oh, let me check. Am I live? Am I live? Can you hear me? Okay. I just wanted you to know my name is Frank Sprague. I'm going to have a drink of water right off the bat. I am just excited to be here. And I'm going to talk about our Salem Keizer School District Music Program. I wrote a book about it. Nobody's ever done it before. And so I'm going to talk about it. First of all, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. I've lived here in Salem for 40 years. And during that time, most of that time I've been a piano technician, sometimes working for the school district, got to know a few teachers. My wife Judith, as Drew mentioned, is an accomplished musician and has been a piano teacher for many years. And so I learned a lot about music from her. And we were both in what is now called the Willamette Master Chorus back in the 1980s when it first started. But I think the thing that really drew me to the district, probably more than anything else, was that all through those years, I watched my children and grandchildren perform in choir, mostly in choir, some in band, even a little in orchestra. And I think soon I will be watching my great-grandchildren perform in the Salem Keizer School District. Isn't that amazing? So, okay. This project that I took on took me 3.5 years to write this book. I did almost 150 interviews, contacted either by phone or in person over 100 people. And I went to untold number of rehearsals, performances, concerts, festivals. I went down to the state competitions for the last few years. And so it took me 3.5 years to accomplish all this, what I put together. Now I brought to you two books, actually, because this one is kind of an addendum to the first one. And it's about people who are involved in music in every kind of way. There's Dick Withnell's in there, a little thing about him, David Metzger. Maybe you've heard of Pam Miller, the great piano teacher over the years. She's in there. Randy Kem, music merchant. Just kind of a scattershot of people who are involved in music in one way or another. Even my grandson's in here. So the other book, though, this is the one I'm going to be talking about, is this a big beast right here called Face the Music Education. And in this book, oh, by the way, I have a clock here. I don't know when I started, so somebody tell me when it's 10 minutes to go and 5 minutes to go. How about you? Okay, will you do that? Or somebody? Okay. Can you? Okay, all right, anyway. All right, so anyway, this book has a lot of stuff in it. It has about why music is important in our public schools. It talks about teachers in the classroom, whether it's a high school orchestra teacher or a middle school band teacher, elementary general music teacher, all kinds of things. Music, our booster clubs that we have in our district here, competitions, all kinds of things. But what I'm going to concentrate on today, just two things. I'm going to talk about the music district program itself and why it's so good. That's the first half. The second half is about how did it come to be that way? You don't just pull a program out of the air and it's good. It had to come to be in some way. So I'm going to talk about that. Okay. I think anybody would tell you, I don't have to tell you, that the most important person in a district music program, is the teacher. The teacher is in the classroom. The teacher is where the rubber hits the road. The teacher is responsible for the kids performing well. I mean, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that. Now, the teacher will bring in the great teachers. will bring in clinicians or people from the outside, guest conductors, and will teach the kids, and they get a different perspective. And that's really great. But it's the teacher's responsibility for the education of the student. And so you have teachers in our district who are dedicated, driven, and they will work long hours into the evenings, on weekends, often without pay. Sometimes they take money out of their own pocket to pay for things. And they love what they're doing. They could be doing something else that pays more, but they love what they're doing. And so, I mean, they could be administrators, but they're reluctant to do that because they just would rather be in the classroom. But the teacher has to be happy. I mean, you can have if a teacher is not supported by the administration, they think they're going to be, she's worried that she's going to have a job, it's going to be cut, or if the principal doesn't like her or doesn't support music and the principal doesn't have too much money, control over the money in a building, but what little he has, he could shift it away from music and for something else. He may schedule against music. The kid wants to take band, and he can't in the senior year because he has to take a class that's required, and it's on the same slot as music, as band. So he can't take it. And so you have this kind of thing that the teacher wants to know that she's supported by the unions, that there isn't strict seniority. I'm going to tell you a story. Down in Eugene, there was this teacher who, and she's in Salem, Keizer now, by the way, was a wonderful teacher. She got second in state in the state competition. And, but it was during the recession, and there were some budget cuts, well, severe budget cuts. And she was, after getting second in the state, she was given a pink slip because she had been there 5 years. And there was an elementary teacher who had been there 6 years, and they gave the elementary teacher who knew nothing about teaching high school choir, gave her the job. And so the choir program at the high school went downhill. This is the kind of thing, the teacher wants to know that when she's trained for, say, orchestra, went to college, got her master's degree, and went and did her student teaching in orchestra, and now she goes to a school, and they want her to teach band. They want her to teach choir. Maybe they want her to teach elementary music, and she has no training for that kind of thing. And this is the thing, so the teachers have to be happy. They want to know that they have the resources, that a band teacher isn't going to walk into a room and he's got all his instruments are 20 years old that the district provides. And this kid picks up a trumpet and it's got red rot on it because it hasn't been cleaned in about 15 years. And it's got pink all over it. And then he blows on it and then there's a hole and it's no good. I mean, they need to know. Gary Frame, when he first came here as choir director back in 1974, he walked into the room and he had 80 kids there waiting for him. There were no risers. And so he had to direct these kids, and they were all this way, you know. And fortunately, the school was very, very supportive. And in the short time, he had risers. But so this is the thing that a teacher wants to know that she has the resources, that she has other teachers that are supportive. Sometimes you get this little fiefdom thing going on, and the choir teacher, the band teacher wants this room, and the choir teacher wants this. Oops, excuse me. I'm sorry. I'm going to take a drink of water from that one. Anyway, and so you don't want this rivalry. You want people. Winter at West, and I'm going to get ahead of myself here. They do a program called Winter at West, and that's because the choir teacher, the band teacher, and the orchestra teacher just meld and they're able to put on this wonderful program every year. And Judith and I have been there 4 years, I think. So anyway, so you have all these things, but the teacher is only one part. As good as she is, she's only one part of the program. She cannot survive by herself. And I'm going to read you a few statistics about Salem Keizer. And I know some people disagree with rankings in competition, so bear with me on this. Let's see. Yeah. Now, we want creativity, but it just gives you a little something about Salem Keizer here. In band, and by the way, these things that I've just talked about, Salem Keizer has addressed those things. So okay, in band, in competition, the state competition, which is for the last 16 out of the last 17 years, Salem has placed first in the state competition in band. Okay. In strings, not full symphony, but strings, for the last 31 years, I looked this up, Salem Keizer's either been first or second in strings and only once not first or second in 31 years. Okay. Symphony, full, band and orchestra get together, symphony, full orchestra, 28 years, first except twice in 28 years. And by the way, when I went down to the state competition, the 2 times that I've seen the symphony, 5 out of the 6 symphonies were from Salem Keizer. 5 out of 6. So in choir, top 3 spots, 24 out of 28 years. Or excuse me, top spot, winner, 24 out of 28 years. And in 2016 and 2017, when I went to the state competition, the first 3 spots were from Salem Keizer. First 3. It was West, South, and Sprague, and they trade places, it seems like. So what? And it's not the whole thing, but it tells you that something's going right, right? Okay, so I'm going to tell you about a few things why our program is so good. First of all, we're supported by the district. The district and the school board knows the success of the Salem Keizer School District and how good it is, and we're fully supported by the district. That's a key, really critical thing. And they hire principals who are supportive. Now, once in a while, you get a principal nowadays that is not so supportive. There was one elementary school I heard of a few years ago where the principal didn't want to go to evening performances. She just didn't want to go. And here's where the teacher showcases the kids. But this is rare now. I mean, it used to be more common. So they hire good principals who support the kids, make sure they schedule classes so you can get the music classes in and all that kind of thing. And believe me, I've talked to some of these principals, and they're very supportive. The community support. Oh, this is huge, huge. Now you get success breeds success. You don't get community support first and then the good program second. Never happens. But I'm going to read you something else here. That first of all, I want to say when I was a kid, I mean, here's the dynamic that goes on today as I see it. You have less and less money for things, and I'm going to read what the district pays for here. The district, let's see, where is that? Right here, I got it. Okay, the district club pays for the essentials. They pay for salaries. They pay for all of that. Some musical instruments, some repair, some sheet music, some transportation to certain events, and instructional support, stipends for work that the teacher has to do after school, and things like that. But here's what they don't pay for. And by the way, I want to tell you that when there's a dynamic going on here, because when I was a kid, I grew up in Montana. And it was a big deal for us to go to 150 miles to Billings for a speech contest, you know. We went to the state tournament for basketball, maybe a couple hundred miles, and it was just a big deal. And yet you got less and less money from the district for different things. Taxes have been cut, and you got more mandated programs, and the legislature has diverting money from the schools to prisons, which is why, and mental programs and all kinds of things. There's less and less money for schools, but people want to do more. You know, instead of going 150 miles down to Billings, they're not content to go into Portland or Seattle. They got to go to Hawaii, China, Australia, Europe, New York, and so we want to do more. I mean, I had one kid, a grandkid, went to Japan for a wrestling thing, you know, and so somebody has to pick up the slack. Here's what the district does not pay for. Doesn't cover choir robes, uniforms, risers, private lessons, tours, additional travel for performances, props, and this is for marching band, props and prop carts, color guard equipment, section coaches for marching band, occasional keyboard or piano, many other items. Just huge, huge. And so some of it is paid for by student fees and so forth, but most of it is picked up by booster clubs. And so this is, and fortunately, Salem Keizer has wonderful music booster clubs, but I got to tell you, I'm going to be candid, it changes from school to school. And I'll give you an example. At West High, in band alone, there are 30 people coming out for every little event. They'll have a coordinator for this and a coordinator for that, a coordinator for props, a coordinator for transportation, and you have about a $200,000 budget. At McKay High School, I went to a meeting for Booster Club, and there were 6 people there for all the music. All the music. And so it varies greatly from school to school. The wonderful thing about McKay and the north end of the town where it's impoverished is that there's a foundation started by Sandy Wiscarson. And they provide more private lessons for students. This is a wonderful thing that's going on in this district. And I think they would probably like to have you join them in helping for the fundraising for this sort of thing. That's another thing that is so wonderful about this district, is there's a lot of private lessons that are going on in schools. Another thing that's really good in this school is that teachers are assured that they will have vertical employment. And what I mean by that is that if you're a choir teacher and you go, you're employed by Salem Keizer, you're not going to have to teach band. You may have to teach if you're it doesn't happen here, and that's another really neat thing, is that the high school teachers are strictly high school teachers in choir, middle school teachers, strictly middle school, and so forth. So a person doesn't have to come here employed as a band teacher and then teach orchestra or teach choir or general music in the elementary. And that's a wonderful thing, isn't it, to have that kind of assurance that you're going to have that. Another thing that I think is really, I call that vertical employment. The other thing is horizontal. You know, there was a choir teacher here at Keizer, Josh Rist, great guy, just a wonderful person, a real people person. And before he came here, he was in Hermiston, and he loved his job. You know, loved the students, the community was supportive. Whenever he wanted to do something, the money was there, just wonderful. But he had no one to speak to who did the same thing that he did. You know, I mean, he could talk to the band teacher, but there was no other, you know. And the wonderful thing, the nice thing about Salem Keizer is that you have this fraternity, you know, here. I mean, every year from what I understand, all the choir teachers, high school choir teachers get together for a barbecue, at somebody's home. And in the middle schools, the teachers get together periodically, the choir teachers, and this happens with band and orchestra too. Every year, they have a swap day. One teacher for a day will teach at the other person's school, and then they'll swap, and then they get together for coffee or something, and they'll tell each other how the day went and how maybe tips they could pick up and so forth. And that is so great, and as I mentioned that, another thing that's going on in this district that is really terrific is that there's support. There's for first-year teachers, and I don't know, it depends on if there's any teachers that need it, but there's a grant for what they call mentoring. So if you're a first-year teacher, somebody will kind of hold you by the hand, and 90 hours of instruction, help, just kind of watching your class, sitting down for a cupcake or something and talk about how you're doing, your first year, that kind of thing. And the other thing is professional development, just terrific, about 4 or 5 times a year in each discipline. Say it's middle school orchestra or general music in somewhere. They'll get together and for 4 hours, and they'll have a speaker come in and give them some tips and everything, and they call that best practices. So say you're a teacher, and you just got a little problem with something, and somebody else is there to help you out and give you some tips that can think that are so good. And the other thing that this is really critical, really critical. In Salem Keizer, if you're a teacher, especially a high school teacher, say you're a high school orchestra, you know that you have kids that are trained coming up. Now, say you go to a nursery and you buy a sapling, and you go back to your garden, and you got the hole there, you got it all dug, and just before you plant the sapling, you take some pruners and you clip off the roots. And then you put the sapling in, and it dies. Why? Because you didn't have any roots. And this is a wonderful thing because it's been saved here, and I'll talk about this in the second half, that the high school teachers, the middle school teachers can be assured that there are kids coming up through the ranks. In Salem Keizer, first of all, we have a wonderful, by the way, does anybody know how much time I have left? Anyway, because of a union agreement years ago, while the regular teachers are out planning, there's a slot for a general music teacher and a slot for a PE teacher back to back, and because of union contract, they can't lay them off. They can't cut that program. It's there, and they get and they see each of these kids once a week for general music, and we've extended the orchestra program so that the kids take orchestra beginning in the 4th grade. And they've worked it out so that the kids in the 5th grade can come before school, because the middle school starts an hour before the elementary. The kids are bused to the middle school, take their hour of orchestra, shipped back to the regular school, and they can do it 3 days a week, 40 minutes a day. And as Carl Roskis, who was the supervisor back when, said, not 35 minutes, 40 minutes. 40 minutes of instruction for 3 days a week, and so they get they're well started by the time they get into middle school, and same thing with band. Band starts in the 5th grade, not as early as orchestra, because the kids, they literally can't hold up the instruments sometimes. Their embouchure, their alignment in their mouth is not as developed and so forth. So they begin down in the 5th grade. But by golly, I tell you, I've heard some of these middle school bands. And they're better than some high school bands I've heard. They are just, and so by the time they get into high school, they're just fantastic. Again, some schools better than others, but anyway, so so we have all these things. And the other nice thing about the union agreement, I mentioned that they're assured vertical employment. Oh yeah, and there's not strict seniority in this district. That's the wonderful thing. I mean, because if you're if you've been around 1 year and you're better than the next person that's been there 15 years, you're going to get the slot. They're not strict like some other districts like that, and that's wonderful. And so they can come in, and so the person can rise on merit rather than seniority, and that's the nice thing about it. Let's see here. Okay, I think I've mentioned all these things. Now, what I'm going to do, but one of the most important thing in a district is the music supervisor, along with the teacher. Now, in 1983, second glass of water. In 1983, there were 26 music supervisors around the state of Oregon. And these people were different. They could hire, they could fire, they could had some control over what they call FTE, which is full-time equivalent. And what I mean by that is a teacher may be full-time, but she's 80% in this school and maybe 20% in another school. I've heard of elementary orchestra teachers going to 9 different schools in 1 week. And so a music supervisor can align all these things and work it out so everybody can work full time and so forth. And so the music, but in 1983 there were 26 of these people, and by 2012 there was one, and that was in this district. And in the second half I'll tell you why that is more. And so the music supervisor, in other districts, they have what is called TOSAs. They're teachers on special assignment. They go around and they can advise, and some of them are even full-time, but they can advise, and oftentimes the principal will take their recommendations and so forth, but they can't hire, they can't fire, they don't really have the full control that a music supervisor has. And that's what we have here. And I'm going to talk about some of our music supervisor here is Mary Lou Boderman. How many people know of her? Wonderful woman. I mean, she's just amazing. Just amazing. She, very bright woman. Was a band teacher at South High for many years, about 21 years, I think. Won the state competition a number of times. She knows music. Boy, does she ever know music. But she's good with people too. I mean, she's tactful, articulate, can be direct at times, but she candid. Believe me, when I asked her a question, I got the answer. I found out, and so she's she has a lot of duties. She's over the 12 festivals that the district supports. And by the way, there are many festivals and concerts in this district. You could not go to all of them in a lifetime. And the ones that are really special in this district are what they call the area concerts, where in every high school area, for each one of the 3 disciplines, there will be 5 minutes. 5. Oh boy, I'm gonna jump the gun. She's over all these festivals. She has a lot of other duties, but I'm going to talk about the thing that she does that's most important: hiring people and firing. Hiring, it's a very complex thing. You know, she'll talk to you. Think that okay, it's just an interview and you're hired or you're not. No, she'll talk to somebody on the phone, go to a job fair, have a chat, and that's just the beginning. Everybody looks good, but then they have to show send a YouTube of what they're doing. And then suddenly they don't look so good. Maybe they're not so good as they said they were. But if they survive that, then they come to the school and they're competing against about 3 other people for the position. And it isn't just another interview. They have to get up in front of this choir here, and they have to conduct real people, real kids who are going to be in that school, and they have to conduct, and they're competing against 2 other people for the same position. Talk about stress. And then the other part of it is they sit there and they have to, there's a formal interview with questions and everything. And these questions are all outlined beforehand. So it's a rigorous process. And then the best person is hired. Not yet. Because they have to go through a background check. And it's very, very rigorous in this district. Now, it could be criminal activity, it could be unethical activity, and a lot of times the other district is not forthcoming. But Mary Lou said there's one question you can ask that usually covers just about everything. To the person in the other district, would you hire this person again? And if they say no, everything stops. And but even then, it could be something. Maybe the other principal in the other district got mad because the person left in August and so forth. So it's a very rigorous process. Let's say that. And the same thing with firing. How many minutes do I have left? I got a couple of minutes. Firing, because of the rigorous interview process, because of incompetence, only 2 people have ever been had to resign because of incompetence. But it's a 2-year program. The first year, they're given a lot of instruction, try to get them up to standard. And the second half of it, by golly, you better resign because you're going to be fired. It's under union contract. So these are, I haven't covered everything about our school district and how wonderful it is, but I hope that in 40 minutes you've gotten a flavor of it, and I'll turn the time over to you for question and answers. So.
And, we do have 2 microphones. Good.
I hope I can answer them.
Wait.
I think the Salem Keizer School District is unsurpassed. I have 3 children who spent each of them 4 years in the orchestra, band, and choir programs. And I totally agree with what you're saying about the position that Mary Lou Boderman has right now and that Carl Roschkas preceded her with. He did a fantastic job as well. The one thing I'd like to say is, if any of you have not seen Mr. Holland's opus, going back to Dick Wathnell, you must watch it. It's a movie you can watch over and over again, and it really is the essence of what a music teacher is all about.
Thankful for making me a statement so that I didn't have to answer a question. So, gentleman over here.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, what do the students who are involved in the program go on to do in music afterward? Do they become professional musicians? Do they teach in the schools? Do they just have it as an avocation, etc.?
A small percentage of students, that's a very good question. A small percentage of students become music majors in school. But that doesn't mean that a lot of them become very active in music afterwards because of their experience. I'll give you one case. There was a kid at Sprague who was probably one of the best choir kids that the teacher ever had. But he went down to the University of Oregon, didn't want to be in music, wanted to be an engineering student. But he wanted to be in choir. So he goes up to the choir teacher and he says, is there any possibility I could be in your choir? And the teacher says, where are you from? He says, Sprague. He says, let's audition. He ended up in the top choir, in the top choir because of his training. But people can do all number of things. Some people, it runs the gamut. But a small percentage of students go on to become music majors, and of those, some of them become teachers and some become performers. They go into the industry, just any number of things. I hope that answers your question. Yes.
Hi, my name is Bob. My wife, Becky, was hired by Dave Dirksen before
Oh,
Carl
yes.
Rashkus, and taught for 20 years, and both of my children were in the music program. In the early days, Becky was she started, I won't give you the history, but when she got to Leslie, she did have to have car washes to buy risers for the choirs. And I'm wondering, you didn't mention that in terms of all the support, the teachers who spend extra time outside of their classes, outside of their concerts, outside of their grading, to raise money for their own programs. Is this still going on? I don't know. We lost.
Well, it depends on the school. For instance, at Sprague Choir, the booster club says, "Mr. Brown, what do you need?" And they take care of it. He doesn't have to lift a finger for that. Other schools, most of the time, the teacher really leaves it up to the booster club because that's what their job is. The teacher should be teaching, and they shouldn't be have to go around raising money. And so I think by and large, what you're saying is that we try to get away from that as much as possible. Yes. Yes, back there.
Yes, I wonder if, I know the test scores in Salem School District are pretty low, in mathematics anyway. And I don't know about science, but why is it that it seems as though the music often gets precedent over things that could be developed in other teaching areas? And plus they have special privileges that maybe other fields of course of study don't have. Why couldn't the model perhaps be applied to, that you've just alluded to, in a vigorous way by science teachers, for example, or math teachers?
Okay, that's a good question, and you know there's a lot of other districts that agree with you fully. Music, why is music important? Music and music is, it teaches so many things. It helps people with math. People who are involved in music full-time do better in their other subjects. They do, it's been proven in all different mental ways, and they learn teamwork, they learn discipline, they learn, they have friendships. When you go back to reunions, what do they talk about? They talk about my English class, and I learned about Plato. No, they talk about that tour they went on, and that they talk about all the fun times they had, and as Bill Kendrick, who I'll talk about the next time, said that it keeps people, these electives, not just music, art, and all the rest, keep people engaged. So they want to learn about the other subjects. They stay in school and they learn the other subject. So I don't know if you've agreed with me after that question, but anyway. Yes, okay, go ahead.
My name is Barbara, and my children went to Sprague in the 70s during the Gary Frame and Pete Fergiola days. And partly answer to the one question, Pete Fergiola's son Peter has been in the Oregon Symphony. At one time, Pete and Leah and Peter were all three in the Oregon Symphony at the same time. But just because they don't become a musician, my son happens to be a musician who didn't want to perform for others, but it was his internal enjoyment. He does now perform now that he's in his 60s, but for years he just played because that was what gave him happiness and peace. So it isn't just the performers that receive value from these lessons.
I just want to say something really quickly here. Of all the other reasons that we have music, one teacher mentioned to me probably the most important reason of all. It's just part of our human nature. It's just part of being human, to be in music. And so I think.
We have to.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Okay. I was listening to what you were saying about the students that come to the schools, but I'm wondering how you overcome what would be the contemporary music environment that the students experience now, because I have watched the complete destruction of American popular music into what it has evolved into today. So how do you get what do you, what do you do to overcome what they may be experiencing on the outside and to show them the other things that music can do?
Tell me a melody you can remember in the last 30 years. Can you remember one?
T for two?
No, that's been composed in the last 30 years. So anyway.
No, I can't, because I don't think there have been any.
Well, anyway, you brought up an important point, because the wonderful thing about it, and this is the thing that I saw, I got probably time for one more answer, is that when kids go into jazz, this is the one thing I noticed. I went to a jazz competition down in North Albany Middle School. The kids were playing 40s music, 40s jazz music. Where would they find that if they didn't go into jazz? They were, the choir kids learn about 15th century choir and all these wonderful things. Would they ever learn it if they didn't take these classes? No, they wouldn't. They'd be hearing pump, pump, pump in 3/4 time, So.
We have time for one more question. We're over here.
Okay.
One more question before break. And
Okay.
I hope there'll be more time afterwards. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. However, I'm going to take the bully pulpit and to give an example of what he was talking about, how the collegiality of the teachers. Josh Rist, whom he mentioned, is a published composer, and he was commissioned by Will McLean, who's at South Salem as the choir director, to compose a piece because South Salem was invited to perform at our national convention. And Josh accompanied it, went along. He teaches at McNary, which is one of the toughest schools in the district.
Yeah.
So they're dear friends.
Yes.
He's absolutely right, and that's fostered by the music supervisor who hires the right people.
Yes.
Good morning, my name is Jinx. We have two sons now in their 30s who were greatly gifted to have participated in the music program here in this district. In fact, the younger one, when he went off to college, was invited by his new university to participate in their marching band, sight unseen, which was rather comical because he played the string bass. As a counterpoint to what you were talking about and how important and wonderful music is in general, and certainly here in this district, and our family would support that, there's also a cost sometimes for those kinds of things. When we go back to the recession, at one point the money was so difficult to come by in the district that major cuts had to happen. And one of those was to eliminate all the elementary librarians. And that was a significant cost, and I think that there would be a lot of people who would argue that it wasn't the best choice.
Yes.
I know it can go both ways, but I just want to mention that there is a cost when we talk about our music program that other people have to pay.
Yes, that's absolutely true. It's too bad that we can't have everything. I agree with you. It was a decision they made at the time, and so anyway. But by golly, I tell you, as we find out in the second half, if we didn't have a certain individual on board, we would have lost music too. So.
Okay, thank you very much, and we'll have a 10-minute break now.
All right. How did Salem Keizer get to this place where it is now? I mean, the school district is, some of you may know, the first school in this district is actually in 1850. The district was formed in 1855. The first high school in 1906. But music didn't really get started until 1910 in band, 1914 in choir. And like every other school district, it was primitive at first and limped along and got better and better. But by in the late 40s, we had kind of a mini golden age. We had Vern Wiscarson, who came here, and he always got superior when at the state competitions. And back then, they rated the kids instead of ranking them like they do now. And the choir teacher was the legendary Lena Beltard, who had been there for 30 years. I could go on and on about her. And then essentially Vern Wiscarson recruited Vic Victor Paulson, who was over orchestra. And so for that little period of time, we had just a wonderful program. By the way, I saw Vic Palmeson, Judith and I saw Vic Palmeson in the Oregon Symphony, still playing his viola in the early 1980s. So we were lucky to see him. Interviewed his wife. She was almost 102. So anyway, so but then Vern Wiscarson became the owner of Will's Music, and the band teacher that took his place wasn't nearly as good, and the choir teacher who took Lena Bell's place was good, very strict, very old school. The orchestra kept going well, and then it kept kind of going along okay. And then in 1954, the Salem Keizer School District opened the second high school, South High. And so the old, by the way, back in the late 40s, it was still a very small school district. Only one high school, 2 junior highs, 8 elementaries. So in 1954, they opened up the high school, and they hired a new music supervisor, and I got his name here. I'm not going to say his name because they're, anyway, he had high recommendations. I mean, he got his PhD at Columbia University. He had taught at many universities around the United States. And so when he came to Salem, there was a lot of fanfare, I mean, for him. And the first thing he did, he was an orchestra guy, really. The first thing he did was put his might behind the Salem Junior Symphony. And he was very successful. He was, in just a matter of a few years, he had a board. He teamed up with the Parks Department, got additional funding from the Parks Department. In 1958, he was invited to go down to the national, what they call then the Music Educators National Conference down in Los Angeles, and he performed the full symphony, performed before 20,000 people. I mean, and he was very successful. He did this for 17 years, and he got high acclaim for what he did. But there was one problem. The Youth Symphony was not the Salem Keizer School District. It was not a district program. And as time went on, he continued, and believe me, one thing about the education, he wanted good kids coming into his program, so he paid attention to that. By the way, Fran Palmeson told me, he was not a guy to light people's fire, you know. He just didn't have that buzz, you know. And another thing, he started to, as time went on, he started to coast in his position, and he didn't leave the office. He would hire people sight unseen, and there were times when he hired people, and they were performers first and educators second. And so you had this a gradual influx of, you know, incompetent people, and people didn't really want to teach. They were just they'd go up and be in the Oregon Symphony and perform, and now I got to teach to make some money, and so this went on for a long time, and this gentleman eventually lost his job as music supervisor, and he was put in the curriculum department. And so by the time that in 1972, when William Kendrick III arrived in Salem, he told me personally that the music program in Salem was struggling. That was his actual word. Now, Bill Kendrick, I don't know if anybody of you here knew him, but he was just perfect for the district. He played the French horn when he was a kid. his wife played the clarinet. He had this music background, but that wasn't his greatest strength. His strength was that he was a real people person. I mean, people just liked him, and he was very, very bright. And he came here not as a music supervisor, not as a music teacher, but the superintendent. And so he came here, and he was a true believer of music. He came here, and oftentimes he would give a talk about music as a metaphor, music, and he would say that music is basic. It's not like it's just not math and English and science. Music is basic. It keeps the kids in school. It keeps them coming, and then they want to do the other subjects so they can graduate and that sort of thing. And but for the first 2 years he was here, he had to deal with possible strikes. And one thing he told me, he says, I don't remember how many school board people he dealt with over the years, both here in Seattle, but he says, I never got fired, never had a strike. And so but he had to put his full energies behind that. And then in 1974, finally, when he kind of got that behind him, he could turn his attention to music. And he hired a guy by the name of Dave Dirksen. Now, Dave Dirksen was a lot like Bill Kendrick. He was a people person. And by the way, I want to say one thing about Bill Kendrick is that he was a guy that got out into the schools. He would be substitutes in the kindergarten. He would sit there and tell the kids how to do stories and help them do their math and all this kind of stuff. He was just a guy that was just a ball of fire. And so he hires Dave Dirksen, who was really kind of like him. Dave Dirksen had grown up right in this area, but he had eventually, when he left Salem, he became the chair of the music department at the University of Oregon. And before here, he was a sales guy for Will's Music. He had a lot of background, and he was just a real people person. When Kendrick hired him, he said to all his principals, when you hire somebody, I want my music guy there. And so Dave Dirksen was in on every hire, and Dave told me that of all the principals, all the hires, nobody ever disagreed with him. And that tells you something about his people skills, because believe me, there are a lot of principals who didn't agree with the music supervisor. So that just tells you something about Dave Dirksen. He hired a lot of good people, and this went along for about 7 years, but there was one problem. He was not a music supervisor. He was put into the Department of Curriculum over music. And he developed a curriculum. He developed a curriculum about what teachers should teach. But there was nothing about how teachers should teach. So if you got a kid that's at this level, how is he going to get to this level? There wasn't anything about that. And then when he was in about 7 years, they wanted to put him not over curriculum, just over music, but all of the arts, theater, drawing, you name it. And he resigned. He says, I didn't come here to do that. Well, this wasn't Kendrick that put this on him, it was some of his assistants. And when Kendrick got wind of it, he brought him into his office and he says, what can we do? What can I do to keep you in the district? And he says, make me a real music supervisor. And so now he had a power to hire and fire. He could get rid of some of the incompetent people. And what he did also during this time, there was a big committee, and they put him in charge of learning what teachers actually did. How do you get a job description for a middle school orchestra teacher? What's the job description for a high school band teacher? And he had to get all these descriptions together, and then he developed a program for evaluating teachers. How are they doing in the classroom? Are the kids really making progress? I'm not just looking at this piece of music. Am I mastering it? Do I have quality? And so and then what he did was really important. He developed what is known as a plan of assistance. Before, there was no structure for hiring an incompetent teacher. Now they worked with the unions. They got a deal going here that over 1 year period of time, if a teacher was incompetent, they could lead them through the process, try to get them up to the standard, and then at the end of that time, if they didn't reach that standard, minimum standard, I might add, they were gone. And most of these teachers actually resigned because then they could apply for a position elsewhere, whereas you know, if they were fired, then they had this on their record. So he was able to get rid of some teachers. And he was just in the process of getting this going when he was hired at the University of Oregon. And he said that, I left because I actually wanted to be with the students. I just loved helping kids become better teachers instead of being in an administrative job. So he goes down to Eugene, and the school has to hire another music supervisor. Long story, don't have time to get into it. But they hire Carl Roschkes, who had been down in California, and he became the music supervisor and was music supervisor for 28 years. Now, Carl Roschkes leads me to believe that I can't tell you how to run a music program because there's only one Carl Roschkes. He had his faults, and I've been told what they are, but he was really a Renaissance man. I mean, I'm going to tell you this. When he was in middle school, he was originally from Austria. They had to flee the country because they were in the Russian zone, and they had to. But because his father was a film distributor for 20th Century Fox, they had it over other refugees, and they landed in California. The 20th Century Fox sponsored them to come to California. And so here he is in the 7th grade. He learns the violin in school, not in some conservatory, not private lessons, but in school. And this middle school that he was in was legendary. It was one of the finest middle schools in Southern California. Their program was better than a lot of high schools. But then the teacher left to be a college professor, and a teacher was brought in who didn't really care about all that stuff. And so here Carl Roschkes is, as a junior high kid, is the de facto teacher. To keep up the standards, the kids had been really rigorous in their rehearsals. He arranges with the janitor to get into school early and teaches kids. Now he knows the violin, but he doesn't know anything about a clarinet. Now I want to tell you about, he has perfect pitch, perfect diatonic pitch. In other words, he can tell the difference between a D sharp and a C sharp and a D flat, and because it helps you with perfect intervals and so forth that you have to have in music. And but he also had great tonal memory. So if a kid had a problem with his clarinet, it didn't sound up to standard, he'd say, you know, could I take this clarinet home? He'd go home and fiddle with it and work out, and he figured out a way to make it sound good. He'd do the same thing with the French horn, same thing with the whatever, you know, the flute. And so he was able to get as a middle school kid, he was able to get the kids up to speed, so he decided at that time he wanted to be a music teacher. And get this, he first goes, the first job he gets is in the ghetto of Los Angeles, South Central LA. Kids, just the roughest area you can get. He gets these kids because he is so, and I wish I could go into all of that, but he gets them up to speed. And they're just the best orchestra in Los Angeles, and it's the Los Angeles School District. And about 90% of them went on to college. So but the problem is he had to go 2 hours one way to get to work. So he was at a middle school, upper middle class middle school, or junior high, I'm sorry, it was back in those days. And then he goes to this extreme other end, this wealthy high school, where the teachers are making millions and they're off in Europe and the kids are left to their own devices and they're smoking marijuana in class and twiddling their flutes and girls are sitting on their laps and again, I don't have time to go into all it, but it was a band, you know. They said, oh, you know, he had to kick out the whole band. And the teachers complained, or I mean the parents complained, and he was almost fired. But some of the parents said saved his job, and he made it into a model band. And eventually there were only 33 left in his band, and they all came back, and so he had anyway. But because of Prop 13, because they were losing all the taxes, and because of the busing thing that was going on there. Education in Southern California was just going down the hole. And so it was a timely time when they called him to be music supervisor here in Salem. And he wasn't just a good musician. And I'm going to tell you some other things about him. He was very creative as an administrator. First of all, he's very strict. Boy, if you were an orchestra teacher or a band teacher, you better be on your... You know, he was known to sit out in a parking lot and look in the window and see if the teacher was working. And then, so he would, he was very strict about standards. He wanted and so, how much time do I have left? Okay, he was great. He had a saying. He says, if there's an administrator in the way, I will go around him. And Mary Lou Boderman says, there's one thing I learned about Carl Roschkes: don't ask. And so so anyway, he was very creative about his administrative duties, but he also cultivated the public. You know, he joined the Rotary. He would have kids come in and perform, and so he built up that the community support and all that. But when he first arrived in Salem in 1983, he immediately had a crisis on his hands. The elementary principals wanted to get rid of instrumental music in the elementary schools. It wasn't worth it. There were hardly any kids in the programs, and they had good reason. There was a system going on in those days where the bad teachers were sent from the high school down to the middle school, and then they sent the bad teachers from the middle school down to the elementary. And so you had all these really incompetent teachers on the elementary. I wish I had the time to tell you about one of them, but I don't. Anyway, Carl Roschkes comes in, and he's got this phalanx of elementary principals saying, we want to get rid of elementary, instrumental elementary music. Well, what did he do? First of all, he goes to Kendrick and says, look, I got all these principals. You hired me to fix this. If they get rid of it, there's nothing left to fix. So and then he doesn't do just that. He goes to the school board members. He says, I don't know if that was protocol, but he went to each one of them. Some of them had kids in school, you know, who were in the music programs. And so, first of all, Kendrick said, I know it's not political, but I'm going to back you on this. That's how much of a believer he was. And they had a vote among the school board members, and he got enough of them on his side that they passed and they kept elementary instrumental music in the elementary schools. So that was his first crisis. The second one, he almost got fired. You know, there was this teacher that was hired at North High School, wonderful orchestra teacher, wonderful. But, you know, North was an impoverished area, and he got the people down at South says, we want you to come down here. And the assistant superintendent said, no, you can't go to South because it's going to be very hard for me to get a good guy up at North. And so the orchestra teacher leaves, goes to Michigan, for some graduate work. Things don't work out. He comes back. He needs a job. And he says, Carl Roschke says, look, I got a job for you at Sprague High. And, well, the assistant superintendent heard about it, and he says, look, Carl, if you hire this guy for Sprague, you can pack your bags for California. And so this shows you how fearless Carl was. He hired the guy anyway. And so he got a letter from the assistant superintendent that says, the secretary says, we want you to come, and by the way, bring the letter. What letter? Well, it was a letter of resignation. So he writes out the letter and signs it and comes over to the office, and the assistant superintendent had just been hired at Pendleton as to be the superintendent. He wasn't even in town. He says, so he went out with the orchestra teacher, and they had a big, nice dinner that night and had a lot of laughs. But the thing is, he probably wouldn't have been fired anyway because Kendrick was behind him. I don't think he would have been fired. He wouldn't have. Anyway, so his next big crisis was they had a system going in those days where teachers, all teachers, could take Wednesday off for planning. It wasn't in other districts. It was just in Salem Keizer. And in theory, it made good sense. A teacher goes home, instead of sandwiching a little planning here and sandwiching a little planning there, they could get to go home for the whole afternoon and plan for the week. But there was only one problem. The kids went home too. What are they going to do? And so they go home and they goof off, probably get into trouble. But the teachers, they were seen at the grocery stores. They were doing stuff they weren't, which they hadn't been hired for. And so Kendrick was feeling the pressure over this because parents were complaining. And so they went back to the planning during the day, and Carl Roschke saw this as an opportunity. And he worked with the union. These teachers have to have so much time for planning. Why not have music instruction during this time, PE, and then they had PE instruction for the other time. And so under union contract, you had all these music teachers coming in teaching general music in the elementary schools, and the program could not be eliminated because it was under union contract. That was a nice thing. They couldn't eliminate them during the recession and Carl had a good crisis on his hands. He had to go out and hire 18 good quality teachers in 3 weeks. And he says, and it couldn't be just any teacher. And he says, I managed to do it. He says, I also got no sleep. So anyway, by this time, with Kendrick firmly behind him, Carl Roschke could do a lot of things. And the first thing what he was going to do is get rid of all these incompetent teachers. And he went around to the schools, and by this, it was still on a one-year thing. The plan of assistance was still 1 year. And they roped these teachers in, and by golly, if they weren't up to standards, they were, you probably should hand in your resignation letter because you're gone. And he got rid of a lot of teachers. Another thing that he did was during this time, there were a lot of teachers, the kids in band and orchestra were getting classes twice a week for maybe 20 or 30 minutes. And it just wasn't enough in his eyes. I mean, by the time they got up to middle school, they just weren't trained well enough. And so that the middle school teacher now had to do a lot of background stuff. And he said, so what he did, and the principals didn't want pullouts, they didn't want kids pulling out kids for music instruction. So and the assistant superintendent says, look, I'm going to eliminate instrumental music in our elementary schools if you don't do something. He says, look, I'll make you a deal. He says, I tell you what, middle school starts 1 hour before elementary school. Why don't we just bus these kids down, the band kids in the 5th grade? They can have an hour of instruction 3 days a week, and then they'll be bused back to the elementary school. And I, you know, I'll leave orchestra alone. And they agreed to that. And then eventually, through negotiations, he was able to do the same thing for orchestra. They bussed him down to the middle school. There was team teaching usually. The middle school teacher and the elementary strings teacher would get together, teach these kids for an hour, and then they were bussed back to the elementary school. And so you had wonderful training for these kids. And Carl Roschke says, I want not 20 or 30 minutes of instruction, 40 minutes of instruction. Don't be fiddling, taking out your instrument and goofing around and things. 40 minutes of instruction. He was rough on people. You know, Keith Weathers, who ran Weathers Music for many years, said, if you were sick, you would want Carl Roschke to be your doctor, but you might not like his bedside manner. So anyway, he was not rude, but he was direct. As David Brown, who's the current choir director at Sprague, told me, he says, what you saw, you got. You know, maybe it wasn't always pretty, but you knew what you were dealing with. You know, none of this political, you know, two-faced stuff, you know. With Carl, what you saw is what you got. And now, but his music, his public cultivation was really important because, and by the way, if you've ever met him, he's just the most charming guy, and he's got full of stories. If you want to laugh, go to Carl Roschke's place. He's got lots of stories, and he'll always laugh after them, too, I might say. And so he's really a funny guy. But, and this is important because he had to deal with because in 1986, Bill Kendrick left to go up to Seattle to be the superintendent up there. And so Homer Kearns came in his place, and Homer was a brilliant guy. He was superintendent of the year in Oregon. He got national awards. He was a very, very, very smart, very, very talented superintendent. But he was more neutral toward music. And so in 1987, when there was a $1 million shortfall and music was going to have to be cut, there were two things that were going on. And this is why community support is so important. Because, first of all, you had Carl Roschke cultivating the hobnobbers, the big monkeys in town, and then you had Keith Weathers over here who rented instruments to kids, and he had a vested interest to keep this program going, and so he asked, who are the most charismatic people, the most passionate parents in town that can all join together with me, and he also threatened to recall the school board, he and his wife. And so anyway, they had this hearing at North High, and literally there was a line that went around the block of people trying to get into the hearing. And when they saw the community support to not eliminate elementary instrumental music, Homer Kearns just threw up his hands and said, fine, I won't do it. And there were a couple of other things when they wanted to cut music, and again, the community was really passionate about it. So Homer Kearns leaves, and in his place was Kay Baker. And again, there was a crisis. The 2001, it's the dot-com bust, and 9/11, and there needed to have another cut. And by this time, in 2001, Friends of Music was started, and probably Alan Bouchon down at, CCTV, was glad to be ahead of it. He had kids in school, loved music, and what they do is a network of all these booster clubs, and they could all get together in a crisis, and they wore these signature blue shirts, and when there was this big hearing, this time down in South Salem at one of the facilities they had there, people were around honking their horns and going around placards and all kinds of stuff, and they saved the program once again. But the biggest one was that came in during the big recession, And Carl Roschkes, by this time Sandy Husk is the superintendent, and there was no getting around it. There was a $54 million shortfall. Everybody was going to have to have a piece of their flesh in this thing. So what he did, he talked to Sandy Husk, and Carl says, what can I do? And she says, I tell you what, cut 3 equivalent full-time positions and I'll let you alone. So he went around, and as you know, he was over FTE. So if somebody was 80%, then he might cut them down to 50%. These are people who still had benefits. Might consolidate a position. Rather than just hacking 3 positions, he would go around and shift people around. Maybe if there was somebody left less than 50%, he might have to eliminate some of those. And through a piecemeal fashion, he was able to eliminate the equivalent of 3 full-time positions. And then he was hit with a bombshell, because Sandy Husk went to the principals and she said, and not necessarily saying cutting music, but you've got to cut so much more money. And what it amounted to for music was 8 more full-time positions, 8 more. And so what he did, he was just flat on his back. And so he, and by the way, the district told him, he says, you do it, you make the cuts, or we will make the cuts. And if we make the cuts, it'll probably destroy music, and you're not going to like it. So he had to go around, and the budget was going to be set in 3 weeks. He had 3 weeks to make all these cuts. He worked night and day, doing the same thing he did before, shifting people around, cutting, part-time from 60% down to 50%, and whatever he had to do. And he cut these positions, did all these things that he had to do. He did this in 3 weeks, night and day, and he says it ruined my health. And that's when he decided to resign. And so when but he saved the program. When programs all around were just falling by the wayside, and a lot of programs are just a shell of their former self. The Salem Keizer program was intact. And that's why you have what you have. That's a big reason why you have what you see today, is because of what Carl Roschkes did. And so when he retired, he had 3 retirement parties in his honor. And so he's the one that recruited Mary Lou to be his replacement. And she didn't want to do that. I mean, she loved band, but the thing about Carl that is so unique is that a lot of teachers, I'd have to say, there are some really wonderful music supervisors, can do a wonderful job when the ship is headed in the right direction, okay? And I'm not saying Mary Lou hasn't had her share of crisis. She's had people who had to be fired or whatever for unethical reasons and stuff, and she had to, in the late stages of the game, had to hire other people. Oh yeah, that's rough. But Carl had to deal with recessions, and all this kind of stuff where the whole program could be dumped. And so for 28 years, I mean, I don't know how you find a replacement. I just don't know how you could do it. But Mary Lou's been just a wonderful person. I think in some ways she's has strengths that he doesn't, because she keeps people here longer. She's more tactful and everything, and so she's a wonderful person, and teachers have a lot of security with her. So I think that's about all I have to say for now. I mean, I might cut out. I got 4 minutes early. Is that permissible? Okay. So okay, I'll just let it go at that. I could talk for hours about one little thing, but I won't. So.
I guess I'm first. I'm Becky, and my question is, First, an observation, and then I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. There are numerous indicators that classical music is in great peril in the United States. Personally, I'm an opera fan. Opera is very expensive. Symphonies are dying and going bankrupt. So I just wonder if you have a comment about the relationship between public school music and the future of music in America.
Well, there's I don't know if I could answer that question adequately. By the way, I can't see the lady. Anyway, there's becoming a shortage of string teachers because so many programs have gone by the wayside, and teachers are going elsewhere. And so a lot of areas of the United States are going to private schools, private conservatories, and these are wonderful. You might get good instruction. For instance, down in California, a lot of these music stores have gone to becoming private schools. And sometimes you get good instruction and sometimes you don't, but whatever it is, the public has to pay for it. And so the thing about Salem Keizer, which is unique, is that we have this wonderful program, and just a few days ago, I talked to the Portland Youth Philharmonic person who conducts that, and they're very interested in making this a success. So it's really important that somehow classic music. Here's another thing that's against you, is that a lot of schools, they're trying to shift away from the three main disciplines toward, pop music and just all various, which is fine, but I think a kid should be disciplined in the main disciplines, and then he can go off and do what he wants to do, because I think they're better trained when they keep these disciplines. Now, I don't know if I've really adequately answered your question, but the truth of the matter is that I heard somebody, who was it, that was in Juilliard as a youngster, because all over the East Coast, these the classical programs you're talking about in public schools are falling by the wayside. And part of it is they're getting rid of music supervisors, and so principals are hiring the music people, and they don't know anything about music most of the time. So you need somebody who knows music to hire music teachers. So, yes.
Hi, this is Cassia. That leads directly to my question, which is, you've talked a number of times about getting rid of incompetent teachers. How do you determine what's an incompetent music instructor?
That's a good question, and what they do they have here in Salem what is known as scope and sequence. This is just for music. To answer this as briefly as I can, a kid, and by the way, they go by ability and not by grade. Some kids have had private instruction at an earlier age, and their parents were very involved in their instruction and so forth. Other kids were just had no parental support whatsoever and everything. So let's see, I'm trying to think of your question. How do they determine an incompetent teacher? So they have what is known as scope and sequence, so that if say an orchestra kid in the fourth grade should learn how to balance his instrument, know the very basics. I don't remember all the things that they should know, but by the eighth grade, they should know this. They should know A, B, and C, and so these are this is a very structured understanding of what a teacher is supposed to accomplish. It's just not left to, well, he's good or he isn't, or maybe he's mediocre. It's a very structured system for determining how much improvement the kids are being made, and they can determine what quality of a teacher that is by the scope and sequence. Does that answer your question? Yeah. That could be. Yeah, there are.
Visit the classroom.
Yeah, they have to take tests and
Visit the classroom. Listen to the music, see how it's operated.
Yeah, and some teachers have more passionate, they're just involved and others aren't. They determine that. And
Hello? This is Arthur. What is your favorite brand of piano? Why do you like it, and how prevalent is it in the Salem Keizer district?
what is my favorite piano, and what is my favorite piano that I can afford? Okay.
Yeah, okay.
My favorite piano is the, oh gosh, it's that German name now. Well, that's the best one. Yeah, that's really the best one. But there's a, I can't think of it.
Bösendorfer?
Anyway, I like, I think Bösendorfer is but they're very expensive, very expensive. I think a good mid-range piano, I really think they're great, is a Yamaha. I think some people think they're too bright, but you know, they hold their tune well, they have a nice tone, and in my opinion, I think they're just a great piano for the school. I think Kwai is another good one. The other piano I was trying to think of was Schimmel. Oh, by golly, those things hold a tune. They are just wonderful piano, but they're very expensive. I don't personally like, I hate, most of the time I don't like upright Steinways, grand Steinways on the big 9-foot grands. They're great. Anyway, that's just me. Go ahead.
I'm Barbara again. I volunteer at the Elsinore, and I have faith that there is hope for the music in the high schools. This weekend we're having the a cappella, the high school a cappella contest, and last year I was just blown away with what these high school kids were doing. So I think there is hope for continued music in the schools.
Is that what they call their jazz group, kind of their...
No, well, it's a cappella. It
A
isn't
cappella, it's the group that has about 16 kids.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are wonderful. You go ahead.
Hi,
Yeah.
my name is Janet. I don't think people in Salem really appreciate that how many schools in Oregon are not having music in the schools. And I don't know, you talked about not having music supervisors, but even offering music, do you have statistics on that?
I don't.
Even some of the, what you consider the better districts, I don't know, Eugene and Portland, some of them don't have music
My
in the schools.
understanding, go ahead. My understanding, the closest thing that we have to here in Salem is Beaverton right now. But do you mind if I end with a little anecdote? If you got another question, go ahead and ask them. But I want to end with an anecdote. Go ahead.
Okay, yes, we have a question here.
Yeah, go ahead.
What is our timeline?
We have time.
Yeah.
Depending on your anecdote.
This is Jackie, and my question is, what is the future of pianos in our culture as compared to keyboards? I taught piano for many years, and I never would allow a keyboard, but now that they're using them all over, what's your opinion on this?
I think it's best that kids learn on an acoustic piano. But I can understand why they have keyboards in schools. They're a lot less expensive. They don't have to be tuned. It's true that they have to be repaired maybe now and then. But there's a different feel from an acoustic piano to a keyboard piano, and you can't get away from that. So I try to take an objective view on that. But so it's just me, my opinion. But I can really understand why people have keyboards in their homes. I mean, you can tone it way down. You can put on the earphones. Nobody can hear you, and that's a great thing too. And they're making them more touch sensitive too, so they're more and more like pianos too.
I think we're ready for your anecdote.
Okay, my anecdote. I just got to tell you this. You asked what's it like in some of these schools. I wanted to go to a sight reading contest for choir when I was doing this book, and they told me I couldn't do it. You can go to the public performances, but you can't go into the room for sight reading. So luckily, I went to the guy who was over the state contest in sight reading, and he says, "Why did you come to this? Yeah, I'll let you in the room. You can be in this room where all the kids are." And he says, "As a matter of fact, this was on a Saturday for the big schools." He says, "Why don't you come on Thursday for the little schools?" And So I did that. And I got to tell you that the private schools is totally different than a small public school. And so I went there, and it was a disaster. I mean, it was a disaster. And one school had 6 kids, and one of them was a boy, you know. And one school hadn't been to the state contest in 14 years, you know. I mean, it was just, the first one, I watched 3 groups, and the first one, the band teacher looked like he was scared to death, you know. And so, and just luckily, I talked to a teacher the next day who happened to teach in one of these schools, and she says it's a totally different dynamic. She says, I had a $100 budget for the whole year. And she says, I'd go in to teach choir, and there was a girl that came in with baby goats, you know, and she would bottle feed them and, while we were having choir. And then another time, you know, she'd want to build up choir, but, you know, the kids couldn't be in choir because they were taking shop. You know, kids couldn't be at a performance because he had to get his license to drive tractors, you know. And so since she was a choir teacher, well-trained, and she was teaching elementary music, she was teaching there was no orchestra, forget that. And the next year she was going to have to teach band, and then they cut her to part-time. So that's my little anecdote as to what happens in some of our little schools. So anyway, I just thought that's my parting shot, so thank you very much.